Hello, welcome everyone to the third talk in our lecture series, Hidden Histories of the Irish Abroad. Um, this lecture is titled The Irish Behind Bars. First, I'd like to welcome you all and I hope you're all enjoying this festive season, strange and unusual though it may be. Before we get started, some quick housekeeping. As usual, questions and answers will be at the end of the talk, though you're very welcome to leave your questions in the chat box throughout the talk, and then at the end, I will come back to the questions and we will see if we can answer some of them. The event tonight is being recorded, so you will be able to watch it back later and hopefully share it with anyone who missed it. I know that there is a lot on tonight and particularly around December, so I'm very grateful for you all for coming and spending this next hour or so with me talking about imprisonment. So then to begin, just a little bit about myself. I'm Maurice Casey and I'm the DFA historian in residence here at EPIC, the Irish Emigration Museum. And what I do in this role really is research different hidden corners of the Irish diaspora and bring them to light as part of our overall mission here at EPIC of sharing the remarkable histories of the Irish abroad. So when we think about the idea of Irish people behind bars, we might think of the long history of Irish Republican prisoners abroad. For example, Terence McSweeney, who died in Brixton Prison while on hunger strike in 1920, and whose centenary was marked this year. Or Constance Markievicz, whose prison letters to her sister sent from Holloway prison were first published in 1932. Stretching back into the 19th century then, the Fenian exiles and the United Irishmen might also come to mind. While those big names often feature in the history and the standard image of the criminal and prisoner might often be read as male, women's criminality and the campaigns of women political prisoners are also a constant of Irish diasporic history. And this has recently been explored in the research project Bad Bridget's. Based at Queen's University Belfast, Elaine Farrell and Leanne McCormick have explored Irish criminal women in Boston, New York, and Toronto in the 19th and early 20th century. They've recently launched an excellent podcast, which I recommend you check out. And then on to a yet more recent well-known example of an Irish person behind bars abroad was the case of Ibrahim Halawa, who was born and raised in Tallaght and who was released in 2017 after finally being acquitted of all charges after spending 4 years in an Egyptian prison. The people I have mentioned are separated by movements, histories, and places, yet they share a place within two broad histories, the history of the Irish abroad and the history of incarceration. Today, the very idea of imprisoning human beings in institutions under the supposed intention of reform is so commonplace as to seem immutable and inevitable. But in fact, the specific forms that incarceration has taken throughout history have changed dramatically in different eras and geographies. From the 19th century to the present day, movements on behalf of political prisoners have functioned as a central catalyst for changes in who gets put in prison and who remains there. There's this concept of the political prisoner, and in particular, the story of one Irish American political prisoner that I want to focus on in our talk this evening. But first, before getting into the schematic of what the talk is going to look like tonight, I wanted to first introduce you to how the history of the political prisoner as an idea was created in part by Irish people abroad. My thoughts on the history of the political prisoner have been indelibly shaped by the work of Padraic Kenney, particularly his 2018 book, Dance in Chains, Imprisonment in the Modern World, which provides an insightful analysis of how Irish Republicans, Russian revolutionaries, and the suffragettes built a political movement angled not just against prisons, but movements within and of prisons. The Irish, the Russians, and the suffragettes crafted the potent political cocktail of civil disobedience inside and outside the prisons, using the prison itself as a means of highlighting the tyranny of those they opposed. The imagery of defiance and courage that emerged when activists began treating trials and prison as a mark of their credentials rather than simply an impediment to their work, was also important to these movements. The legacies of this activism are everywhere today. Civil disobedience is often carried out with the express desire of imprisonment, because in the eyes of the activist, the charge itself becomes an indictment of the very system that is handing it down. Among the most sympathetic of these prisoners of conscience are those imprisoned for crimes which they, and many outside the prison, were convinced they did not commit. It is that category of political prisoner whom I want to speak about today. I decided that tonight I would focus on one particularly remarkable case, and I hope that by the end of the talk you will be similarly fascinated by this story. The title of the series is Hidden Histories of the Irish Abroad, and while I do my best to stay true to the promise and the title of illuminating less considered historical events and people, sometimes you simply have to cover the big names in a topic. But the case of Thomas J. Mooney is not today a well-known case in Ireland. A time traveller from the 1930s would have probably been shocked to hear this, because from the start of his imprisonment in 1916 and over the 2 following decades, Tom Mooney was among the most famous Irish Americans in the US. Arrested in 1916 and charged with bombing a San Francisco parade on perjured evidence, this Irish American radical spent 22 years in prison for this under this charge. I first encountered the case of Tom Mooney in the archives a few years ago, specifically the National Library of Ireland, when I was working with the papers of Irish Republicans and radicals from the interwar period. For radicals in his ancestral homeland, Tom Mooney's name was well known. Some, such as Hannah-She Skeffington and Jim Larkin, visited Tom Mooney in prison. Others in Ireland knew him by his international reputation as a symbol of injustice in the United States. And as I repeatedly encountered references to Mooney's imprisonment, I started becoming very interested in his case and tuning in to the documents that I found. Without fail, whether I traveled to an archive in Moscow or trudged through an Oregonian blizzard to access an archive in the US city of Eugene, I would inevitably come across some mention of Tom Mooney. Although most people acquainted with the history of the American labor movement will have some familiarity with Tom Mooney's case, only a handful of books have been published about him since his death in 1942, a handful in English and one in Russian. In Ireland, there is no public memory of the Mooney case. Indeed, when I published an article about Mooney's Mayo-born mother, Mary Mooney, a few months ago, I received several responses from local papers and researchers in Mayo who were fascinated by the seemingly forgotten piece of local history. You can imagine this talk then as a way of playing a part in writing a further injustice heaped upon Tom Mooney, that he should come to be forgotten in his ancestral home. Sitting in prison, Tom Mooney came to understand that his story was not just the story of one man behind bars. It was a story of a system and the diverse world of radicals intent on overthrowing it. In the words of the well-known US true crime writer Kurt Gentry, whose book on the case has been useful in finding out the broad details of this story, the Mooney case not only covered an era, it contained it, holding in microcosm all the major forces and movements of the time. The Mooney case brings into view a number of moments in US history, from the dawn of the civil rights movement decades before the rise of Martin Luther King to the birth of Roosevelt's New Deal. But at its most human, the story played out within the relationships between one imprisoned man and those most dedicated to his cause who waited for him on the outside, Tom's wife Rena Mooney and his mother Mary Mooney. The story is, at its heart, an Irish-American family tragedy, and it begins, like most such tragedies, with a journey from Ireland to America. Tom Mooney's mother, Mary Heffernan, pictured here at one of Tom Mooney's many trials and hearings in the 1930s, was born in Balmullet, County Mayo, around 1849 in the midst of Ireland's Great Famine. When she was around 16, she emigrated with her sisters to the US. The Heffernan sisters became part of a broader emigration history of young, single Irish women finding their way to urban America. Settling in Holyoke, Massachusetts, Mary fulfilled another standard part of the Irish emigrant story. She married into the Irish diaspora community. Bernard Mooney, Mary's husband, was born in Indiana, the son of Irish migrants, and worked there as a miner. Together, they had 3 children. Tom, who was born in Chicago in 1882, followed by John and Anna. The family moved around when the children were young, joining Bernard on his mining contracts through the states of Washington, Indiana, and Illinois. An organizer for the Knights of Labor, an early American labor organization, Bernard Mooney was once shot in the leg during a strike by a strikebreaker. Although he, in turn, managed to shoot his assailant in the chest, Bernard emerged from the situation the worse off. He developed a lame leg, and soon after came down with an illness that in particular ravaged mine workers, tuberculosis. Shortly after the 10th birthday of the eldest child, Tom, Bernard died with TB. Mary Mooney decided to return to Holyoke, Massachusetts, where her sisters still lived. She received work sorting through rags in a paper factory, thereby ticking another box in the standard history of Irish women's immigration to the US, employment and industry. The Mooneys had always placed an emphasis on their children's education, and Tom attended school until the age of 14, thereafter taking up work in the same paper mill that employed his mother. After a year in the paper mill, Tom found work in a series of foundries, working as a moulder. This was also where he first became involved in union activity, gaining a reputation for a confrontational approach to employers whom he challenged over working conditions and wages. In his early 20s, he saved up enough money to set out on a European journey, traveling through Ireland, Wales, Scotland, France, and Belgium, visiting museums and galleries and dreaming of becoming an artist. By this point, Mooney was a member of the International Moulders Union and voted for socialist candidates, but in this era of scientific socialism, his politics seemed not yet fully formed. This all changed by merit of a chance encounter in a Rotterdam art gallery when Nicholas Klein, a socialist author who wrote a children's primer in leftist politics and contributed to the International Socialist Review, noticed a young man wearing a Moulders Union pin admiring a Rembrandt. Klein introduced himself to the young Tom Mooney, and the two met over the next 2 days and discussed the finer points of socialism. Upon his return to the US, aged 25, Tom Mooney joined the Socialist Party. The year was 1908, and Eugene Debs, the celebrated Socialist Party candidate, was setting out on his election campaign. Mooney joined the campaign and travelled on the Red Special, the Debs campaign train, which crossed the country. And you can see the young Tom Mooney pictured here in this photo on the left. He's standing out of the train carriage holding the Debs flag. A year later, Mooney first crossed paths with another leading radical of the era in Spokane, Washington, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the Irish-American wobbly with ancestral roots in Galway, who later became a stalwart of the Communist Party. She remembered Mooney in her autobiography as a rosy-cheeked, black-eyed, laughing young Irishman. Gurley Flynn noted further that Mooney was, at the time of their meeting in 1909, fighting to win a contest for who could get the most subscribers for the International Socialist Review. He eventually came second place in this contest, winning himself a trip to the 1910 International Socialist Congress in Copenhagen. The 1910 Congress was like a pre-war revolutionary version of Glastonbury 2013, and it had a killer lineup of attendees that included Keir Hardie, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Clara Zetkin, big names in the international socialist movement. Mooney was particularly taken by Russia's Alexandra Kollontai, whom he remembered as the most immaculately dressed woman at the Congress. Mooney had, before in 1908, also been charmed by one Rena Brink Herman, a music teacher from Kansas, who left her first husband for Tom. Together they moved to San Francisco, where Rena established a music studio. Kurt Gentry notes that the studio also served as a meeting place for Tom and his friends, most of whom were, like himself, young union officials, or radicals rather. Mooney delved into the practicalities of radical organizing, moving from strike action to union meetings on the back of his motorcycle. The entire Mooney family, his mother Mary, siblings John and Anna, soon joined Tom and Rena in San Francisco. Mooney was building up his network of revolutionary contacts, making connections with people such as the anarchists Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, the Cork-born famous Labour figure Mother Jones, and Lucy Parsons, a really interesting figure who was the revolutionary Virginia-born daughter of an enslaved woman whose boarding house in Chicago hosted roaming radicals, including Tom. It was around this time that Tom also met a young man with whom his fate would become intertwined, Warren K. Billings. So Mooney's militant organizing in San Francisco soon found him a nemesis in the form of Martin Swanson, a private detective working for business interests in the city who became focused on neutralizing Tom and his radical network. This was an era of labor sabotage, a prominent tactic being the dynamiting of infrastructure such as power lines that were being used to run industries where the workers were on strike. Tom Mooney was arrested in the summer of 1914 on charges of planning to dynamite an electrical tower, but the case was dismissed by the jury. There were rumors in the air that Mooney was due to be set up. One piece of gossip was related to an Irish friend of Tom who had recently arrived in the US from Ireland, Jim Larkin, of the 1913 Dublin lockout. Larkin was warned against associating with Mooney by an off-duty police officer in San Francisco who intoned ominously that something was about to happen to Mooney. As hostilities escalated in Europe at the time of the First World War and the landscape became pockmarked by the trenches, the US remained outside of the conflict. There was, however, a growing movement calling for direct US involvement, and in the summer of 1916, a Preparedness Day parade was organized. Patriotic language encouraged San Francisco residents to show their readiness for a military fight, and businesses mandated their workers to participate. The movement, of course, had its antagonists, including pacifists, anarchists, and socialists. The Blast, a journal edited by the Russian-born anarchist Berkman, and to which Tom Mooney contributed an article in 1916, asked of its readers, what then are the workers to prepare for? Have the workers of America an interest in attacking some foreign country? On 20th of July 1916, a protest rally was called in opposition to the forthcoming parade. Thousands attended, but Tom and Rena Mooney did not. They were on vacation at the time. The Mooneys returned from their vacation, and on Saturday, 22nd July, they ascended to the roof of the Eilers building where they lived to watch the parade. At 2:06 p.m., as the parade was half an hour into its run, a bomb exploded at Stewart and Market Street near the ferry building. Concealed inside a suitcase, the timed explosive killed 10 and left 40 wounded. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the city reeled. A campaign was launched immediately to apprehend those responsible, with many investigators looking to the city's radicals, who had fervently resisted the parade, as likely culprits. A fund of $17,000 was offered as a reward for apprehending the bombers. On 26th of July, 4 days after the explosion, Mooney's home was raided, and an associate of Tom and Rena, Israel Weinberg, was arrested. A day later, Tom and Rena were arrested. Warren Billings, a young radical friend of Mooney's, was also brought in. In the aftermath of the explosion, the feverish atmosphere in the air, that led to few in the labor movement speaking out on behalf of the defendants. Two who did speak, however, were the anarchist couple, Berkman and Emma Goldman, who were convinced of their defendants' innocence. Goldman recalled in her memoirs how they and their Irish-American anarchist comrade Eleanor Fitzgerald set about organizing the early publicity for the case, also bringing in Robert Minor, an LA-based socialist who had become one of the leading voices in Mooney's defense. We should have come to their assistance even if we had thought them guilty of the charges, Goldman remembered, but Alexander knew all of the accused well, and he was absolutely certain of their innocence. Goldman also reached out to Frank P. Walsh, a prominent Irish-American lawyer who had become known in the 1920s in particular for his defense of Irish Republicans and other radical causes. Although unable to take Mooney's case in 1916, he would later provide pro bono work to Mooney in the 1930s. In early 1917, the key defendants went on trial. In an antagonistic courtroom, Mooney and Billings were sentenced, and Mooney was given a death sentence. Tom Mooney's mother, Mary, was present during the trials, as were his siblings, John and Anna. In a later trial, Rena, Tom's wife, was acquitted after it was revealed that the eyewitness who had led to her conviction had committed perjury. The same witness had been involved in Tom's trial, yet his death sentence, handed down by one Judge Franklin Griffin, still stood. The case made by the prosecution against Tom Mooney and Warren Billings, already compromised at the time of the trial, quickly withered away as more and more came to light to reveal how agents had suppressed and manipulated evidence. Witnesses had committed perjury. Soon became apparent that a photo which depicted Tom and Rena on the roof of their home, more than 2 kilometers away from the scene of the explosion, had been doctored by the prosecution. The photograph was important because key witnesses claimed to have seen all of the defendants at the scene itself before the explosion. Yet, upon further inspection, it was discovered that the undoctored photograph had a legible clock face in it, showing a time of 1 minute past 2. The photo thus showed Rena and Tom more than a mile away from Stewart and Market 4 minutes before the explosion took place. Yet perhaps the best indication of how poorly constructed the case against Mooney and Billings was comes from a 1955 interview with Mary Gallagher, a radical organizer of the interwar era whose father was from Leitrim. Gallagher was asked to recall one of the most memorable moments of her time with the Mooney case. She described a meeting she helped organize in LA in 1929 where the principal speaker was Judge Franklin Griffin himself. It was such an astonishing thing, she remembered, that the judge who sentenced Tom Mooney to death would go to the trouble to travel many miles to stand on a platform and declare his belief in Mooney's innocence and in the fact that Mooney had been deliberately framed. Nonetheless, Mooney went into San Quentin, and after his incarceration, Mooney's mother, born in Mayo, Mary, pictured here saying goodbye to Tom, would become one of his most active campaigners. Through the agitation of Berkman and Goldman in particular, the Mooney case immediately went global. On the other side of the world, striking women in the Russian city of Petrograd set off a catalyst of events that would give rise to the world's first socialist state. On April 22, 1917, the American ambassador to the Russian Empire asked his valet to load a revolver and bring it to him. An anarchist protest was, at that moment, winding its way through the Petrograd streets, chanting Tom Mooney's name, and the ambassador feared they would attempt to storm the embassy. The protesters dispersed, in one account because Cossacks charged them. Robert Minor, writing for the Ohio Socialist in March 1918, noted with a flourish that there is hardly a Russian village where the name of Tom Mooney has not been heard, and that Mooney and Billings' names are spoken in Siberian villages, and regularly a certain California district attorney is cursed around the samovar. At the same moment that the Petrograd protest took place in April 1917, the Irish feminist Hannah She Skeffington was travelling through the US on a tour drawing support for the Irish Republican cause and speaking about her husband's murder during the events of the Easter Rising. In San Francisco, She Skeffington was approached by Mary Mooney and asked to speak out on behalf of her son. She Skeffington duly agreed and visited Mooney in jail. She found him anxious that details of his case should get to Ireland, and he asked her to send greetings to Irish workers. She would later become the most active Irish-based activist involved in publicising Mooney's cause and corresponded with Mooney in San Quentin prison up to the 1930s. By the summer of 1917, the holes in Mooney's case were immediately apparent, yet he was still scheduled to hang. President Wilson intervened, requesting a new trial for Mooney, yet in July 1918, Mooney was removed from the county jail to await his execution in San Quentin. Then in November, Judge Griffin, having realized the faults of the case, wrote to the California governor underlining that it would be a travesty for Mooney to be executed. The governor commuted Mooney's sentence to life imprisonment, and Mooney responded with characteristic forcefulness, his signature demand, which was total freedom or death. Now prisoner 31921 in San Quentin, serving a life sentence and tasked with peeling potatoes in the prison kitchen, Mooney's long campaign for justice was only beginning. And here's an image of him in his San Quentin cell, and in the back of the room, a portrait of his mother, Mary. For those in the labour movement, Mooney's case was a clear symbol of how moneyed interests could pervert justice in their favour. Yet Yet for his mother, the reason to fight for her son was more instinctual. I never was active in the labor movement. I never was active in the labor movement myself, she was quoted as saying, but I knew Tom was a good boy, and I knew he would do whatever was right. Across the 1920s, meetings were held to call for Mooney's release, and his case was often aligned with that of Sacco and Vanzetti, the Italian anarchists who were eventually executed, what many believed to have been similarly falsified evidence. Yet it would be the late 1920s, following the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, and particularly with publicity from the international communist movement, and through the efforts of the Irish-American organiser Mary Gallagher, that the Mooney campaign would take on a new, more prominent place in the wider world. Mooney's campaign, its international reputation, perhaps even its ultimate, though not uncomplicated success, cannot be fully grasped without discussing the role played by the international communist movement. In the late 1920s, with a growing ferocity in the early 1930s, the Mooney campaign began to collaborate closely with the International Labour Defence, a transnational organisation dedicated to the plight of political prisoners that was backed by the Comintern, which was itself the Moscow headquartered organising body of the international communist movement. Although communists backed this organisation, the International Labour Defence was open to broad left participation. It was also during this period that Mooney's earlier chance meeting in a Rotterdam art gallery decades before had a remarkable coda, which was noted by Kirk Gentry in his book on Mooney. In 1927, after Mooney had spent more than a decade behind bars, a letter arrived at San Quentin from the socialist author Nicholas Klein, who wrote, "The other day I was in an art gallery where I met a young chap 20 years ago. I wonder if that chap is sorry for the meeting." Mooney's response was that he had never regretted that meeting. In January 1926, a new journal emerged on the US left, pictured here, Labour Defender, the Journal of the International Labour Defence. Its first editor was a man from Inishmore, one of the largest of the Aran Islands, Tom O'Flaherty. In the 1920s, Tom was one of the most active US communist journalists, and in editing this Labour Defender, he brought into existence one of the most visually striking publications of the period. Tom Mooney first appeared on the cover of Labour Defender in July 1928 on the 12-year anniversary of his imprisonment. And it was really the early years of a pact made between Mooney and the communists, that he would rely on their expanding organizational and publishing apparatus to publicize his case, and in turn, they would benefit in prestige from linking up with one of the major cases of injustice of the era. I also found a document from the Moscow archives that revealed how in 1937, the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party assigned a sum of $10,000 to the defense of Tom Mooney. Of course, for those of you with an understanding of Soviet history in the 1930s, the particular determination with which international communists fought for political prisoners in their own country may seem discordant. At the end of that decade, the Soviet state processed startling numbers of its own citizens on precisely political charges. Communists understood the imprisonment and execution of political prisoners in the Soviet Union as legitimate because these were, in their worldview, counter-revolutionaries, and thus, to them, incarceration appeared justified, in contrast with the imprisonment of leftists in the capitalist world. One of the many paradoxes of the communist experience is that same commitment which led them to euphemize the violence of the regime they supported also encouraged their involvement in social justice campaigns and anti-fascist struggles with long-lasting legacies. A moment in the broader history surrounding the Mooney campaign vividly underlines this. In May 1932, Tom Mooney wrote a letter from San Quentin to W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the leading Black intellectuals of the Anglophone world in the early 20th century. In the letter, Mooney wrote to Du Bois that in the autumn of 1918, in my condemned cell awaiting execution, I read a story in some paper that stamped itself upon my mind so deeply that nothing this side of the grave will ever erase it. The article, Mooney continued, was about a cruel attack upon members of your race, a lynching in Georgia. I want you to know that all my adult life I have been keenly, warmly, and sympathetically interested in the problems that confront your race, and that I hate the hundreds of wrongs they have suffered with all of my being, Mooney wrote. Why, at this particular moment in 1932, was Tom Mooney remembering an article about a lynching from 1918? The answer is linked to events which took place a year earlier in Scottsboro, Alabama, when a group of black teenagers and boys traveling by train were arrested by police and accused of raping two white women who had been traveling on the same train. After the teenagers were taken to Scottsboro jail, an angry white crowd surrounded the building, and the National Guard had to be called in to prevent the lynching of the arrested. The initial Scottsboro trial of the 9 accused was conducted in just 3 days with an entirely white and male jury. The sentences of death by electrocution delivered for the teenagers, the youngest of whom was only 13 years old, prompted a campaign for reprieve and retrials. There was, as Priyamvada Gopal notes, no evidence of their guilt. The prosecution was based on the testimony of the two women, one of whom recanted. Yet the nature of the case, sexual assault in the American South, made certain civil rights organizations wary of taking it on board forcefully. The International Labor Defense, directed by communists and radicals who had little reason to place faith in the US justice system, particularly when the case concerned those on the bottom rung of US society, staunchly took to the boys' defense. In 1932, the International Labor Defense and its international affiliates decided to link Tom Mooney's case to that of the Scottsboro Boys as a means of, quote, breaking the walls of racial prejudice, and an international Scottsboro Mooney tour was set in motion. Linking one of the most prestigious cases of an imprisoned white radical to the case of working-class black teenagers awaiting execution was in and of itself an anti-racist statement. All of these lives are equally deserving of justice. It was time for one of Tom Mooney's staunchest defenders to step into the spotlight of history, his 84-year-old Mayo-born mother, Mary Mooney. Mary Mooney was enlisted by Tom into the Scottsboro Mooney campaign and was tasked with traveling the world from San Francisco to Moscow to speak on behalf of her son and the Scottsboro Boys. Writing to a friend in Ireland, Tom Mooney described how the platform would work. Mother does not speak except for saying just a few words, he noted. Then a very brilliant member of the colored race, Richard Moore, who has been Mother's companion for the past several months, along with another Jewish girl comrade, do the real talking on the case. Mother's presence is a drawing card. The brilliant member of the colored race, described by Mooney, Richard Moore, was an Afro-Caribbean communist intellectual, while the Jewish girl comrade was, I believe, Miriam Brooks. At the age of 17, Brooks was given the task of acting as Mary Mooney's escort on the tour. Tom gave Miriam a copy of Maxine Gorky's book, Mother, before she set off on the journey. Mothers of the Scottsboro Boys, such as Viola Montgomery and Ada Wright, also appeared alongside Mary Mooney on the platform. Mary Mooney was often reported as speaking with a distinct Irish brogue, and her quoted statements were this kind of incantation. Tom is innocent. I am here to join with you in his release, the release of the Scottsboro Boys and all class war prisoners. The tour itinerary collided with the case of the Scottsboro Boys as it made its way through the Supreme Court. The Afro-Caribbean radical intellectual Cyril Briggs, who had earlier taken a keen interest in Irish republicanism, wrote for the Labour Defender in November 1932 that the solidarity of the white workers of the world with the persecuted Negro masses was dramatically demonstrated in the courtroom itself with the entrance of Mother Mooney, mother of Tom Mooney, victim of another notorious frame-up. The climax of the tour, which crossed the US and hit several cities in Europe, was Moscow. Ahead of the tour's arrival, a letter was dispatched from Tom Mooney in San Quentin prison to Joseph Stalin, which was printed in the US Communist press and also translated into Russian and featured in the Soviet daily Pravda. Mary Leader, an American expat in the USSR, recalled that a tentative understanding existed that Stalin would see Mother Mooney. Several times during her stay, arrangements were supposedly made for an interview, but each time something interfered. She met with a few officials, and that was all. She was a frail old woman, rather bewildered, who seldom left her hotel. Yet, even that potentiality is somehow represents how remarkable the story is, that a Mayo woman might have met Joseph Stalin. Here is a notebook kept by Miriam Brooks on the tour, which suggests some of the officials that Mary Mooney might indeed have met. One likely figure noted here is the head of the Soviet organization MOPR, Yelena Stasova, one of the leading Bolshevik women revolutionaries of the Soviet era. Regardless of whom she met or what sights she did or didn't see, it was certainly a long life journey from rural Mayo to revolutionary Moscow. Upon returning, Mary Mooney was asked what she thought of Russia, and she replied that she did not like it because it was too cold. She stuck out the entire tour, despite the fact that she discovered a medical emergency midway and permanently lost much of her eyesight. As each of his biographers attest, Tom Mooney was an undoubtedly dictatorial personality with an unattractive propensity for egotism and selfishness. The source material often reflects how Mooney pushed those closest to him to dedicate every moment of their lives to his release, and was incapable of conciliation or understanding when his family and comrades proved unable to keep up with the strenuous demands he placed upon them. Nevertheless, at least in the case of his mother Mary, a familial bond ensured that she followed his requests, even to the detriment of her own health. The 1930s was the high point of the Mooney campaign as a cultural phenomenon. Here is one of the most remarkable. It spawned a lot of remarkable visual imagery, but this triptych by Ben Shahn is very interesting, showing Mary Mooney looming over the Supreme Court with Tom in the middle, and then the famous clock at 1 minute past 2 on the right. So there was art, one experimental documentary film, songs, in addition to the mass rallies that were always a feature of the movement. There were also poems, at least two by major leftist poets of the day, Stoneface by the Dublin-born poet Lola Ridge, and Tom Mooney Walks at Midnight by the leading proletarian poet Mike Gold. The Mooney movement repeatedly failed to produce the one thing upon which it was predicated, Tom Mooney's release. Mary Mooney died in 1934 after a summer of labour unrest. She did not live to see her son released from prison, and Tom Mooney was not allowed to leave San Quentin to attend her funeral. The funeral was attended by 10,000 in San Francisco's Civic Auditorium, and Mary Mooney lay in wake beneath a banner declaring, "Mother Mooney, we will finish your fight." How was the fight finished? Well, one route to Tom Mooney's pardoning was through the governor of California granting that pardon, but that in a state that did not elect democratic governors in the first decades largely of the 20th century was near unimaginable as quite a radical demand. However, fortunately for Mooney, a radical candidate stepped into the fight. In 1934, the novelist and socialist Upton Sinclair ran for the governorship of California on the EPIC plan, which has nothing to do with our museum, but in fact stood for End Poverty in California. Sinclair ran as a socialist candidate within a centrist party, the idea being that if he seized the party's nomination, then he could kind of capture the party system. Sort of akin to how Bernie Sanders ran in 2016 and 2020 for the Democratic Party presidential nomination. Sinclair was actually successful in winning the Democratic Party primary to become their gubernatorial candidate. To support his campaign, Sinclair published a book in which he kind of had a speculative imagining of what a future under his governorship would look like. In this fictionalized future, he imagined his first moments in office as follows. Immediately after having taken the oath of office, he stepped to the microphone and said, "As governor of California, my first action is to sign a pardon to Thomas J. Mooney." Sinclair's candidacy was unsuccessful. He lost to the Republican Frank Merriman, but his performance nonetheless stunned observers and helped bring Roosevelt leftward in envisioning and enacting the New Deal. The tide was shifting in the American political landscape, and indeed the international one. The Popular Front era brought into effect new radical coalitions. symbolised in the bittersweet memory of the international left by the broad movement that came together to defend democracy during the Spanish Civil War. The communist organised Abraham Lincoln Battalion in Spain had a machine gun company named after Tom Mooney, pictured here with a flag emblazoned with his name in 1937. Mooney stood to benefit from any leftward shift in the political landscape. In January 1938, a Gallup poll revealed that 64% of the American population supported a pardon for Mooney. In the race for governor for that year, Culbert Olson, a Democrat who was known for advocating for Mooney in the state legislature, ran as the Democratic candidate. By no means a radical in the Upton Sinclair sense, Olson received backing from Roosevelt, which Sinclair did not. After the Supreme Court ruled against Mooney once more on October 10, 1938, it seemed like an Olson victory was the only hope Mooney had of seeing freedom before the start of the 40s. After a challenging campaign, Olson won, taking office in January 1939. In September of that year, Mooney was finally pardoned. And I'm going to play for you a short clip of Mooney's moment of being pardoned. You'll note behind Mooney, the very overjoyed woman is Mrs. Rena Mooney, so his wife.
California's state capital sees the climax in a 22-year fight for freedom as Governor Olson grants a pardon to America's most celebrated prisoner, Tom Mooney, with Mrs. Mooney present.
Tom Mooney, will you stand up? I am signing, and I will now hand to you, Tom Mooney, a full and unconditional pardon. I will instruct Warden Smith to release you to the freedom which I expect you to exercise with the high ideals I have tried to indicate. Your Excellency, I am not unmindful of the tremendous significance of this occasion and all of the forces that go to make it. To that night, back in 1917, when a jury filed into the courtroom, and I observed the foreman of that jury, who later said, Tom Mooney was the calmest man in that room. I am not unmindful of the fact that this case is in reality not the case of an individual charged with a crime of murder. I know that it symbolizes our whole economic, political, and social life, and all of the forces that go to make it up. I thank you, Governor Olson.
Today, after nearly a quarter century, Mooney's fight for freedom is won.
So, that gives you a sense of some of the emotion of the period. Tom Mooney, in a survey around this time as well, was ranked as one of the 5 most famous people in the United States, which would surely put him as the world's most famous Irish American at that time too. But it's remarkable then that there's so little public memory of him in terms of how we think of the history of the Irish diaspora. This is a picture of Tom Mooney directly after that pardon, walking in a march down Market Street, down the San Francisco street, which he was accused of bombing. In this photo, he was pointing upwards. I don't know for sure, but I would assume that what they're pointing at is the roof of the Islanders building, so the roof that they were photographed sitting on at 2:01 p.m. on July 22nd, 1916. And yet this euphoria-inducing press photos of a free Tom Mooney walking down this San Francisco street, backed by his wife Rena, his brother John, and his sister Anna, merely portrayed the illusion of a happy ending. Journalists also found touching Tom's symbolic act on the first morning after his release. He planted a rose bush at the grave of his mother, and you can see him here with John and Anna also pictured, all of them in tears. But there were further twists and tragedies awaiting the Mooneys. Mooney immediately set out on a nationwide tour, organized by the US Communist Party. For years, the Mooney movement was consumed by observers not only as a dramatic legal case, but also as a kind of love story, a tale of Mother Mooney's care for her son and of Rena Mooney's loyalty to her husband. Attendance at Mooney's celebrations dropped sharply when this drama took a twist strongly disliked by those observing. Tom Mooney was reported in the national press as having filed for divorce from Rena Mooney. Although Tom dismissed the reports as attempts to undermine his post-prison campaign, he confirmed their separation and stated that their relationship had been functionally over since 1923. Rena, for her part, was quoted in the media as being in a state of shock, and she believed the Communist Party had requested Tom separate. The years of prison left Mooney in a weakened state. Remembering Tom Mooney in his final years, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn wrote that it is wishful thinking and an evasion of reality to think for a moment that prison does not affect the political prisoner. It is designed not to assert, but to destroy human dignity. Incarceration destroyed Rena and Tom's relationship and appears to have irreparably damaged the Mooneys themselves. Tom died in March 1942. He was at liberty for just 3 years. He spent more than 2 of those years in a hospital bed, suffering from the lasting legacies of his imprisonment. Long after Mooney's death, the question still lingers. If Mooney did not plant the bomb in 1916, then who did? So a picture there from Mooney's wake with Rena, John, and Anna. So who planted the bomb? The truth is, there is no conclusive answer to this question, though there's a number of theories with some credibility. You have the standard lone actor theory that someone, for reasons unknown, acting alone, planted the bomb. But then there are others that weave together the political history of the time. There is the Mexican theory, the idea that a Mexican nationalist or revolutionary wanted to attack a parade that featured veterans of US incursions into Mexican territory. 4 of the witnesses whose testimony can still be considered credible described a man Spanish or Mexican in appearance placing the suitcase that they believed contained the bomb. Yet the theory that appears to hold the most water, though it is again by no means conclusive, is the German theory. In the midst of the First World War, the German consulate on the western coast US was engaged in acts of espionage and sabotage. That much is clear and evidenced. There is a narrative that the Mooney campaign itself also built around the revelations of this clandestine work to suggest that an agent working on behalf of the German consulate planted the bomb. But there is no smoking gun, and even this theory contains holes and contradictions, and nothing seems to have emerged from the German archives of the time to back it up either. These are the unknowns of the case, but we do know more about the legacies of Mooney's campaign. It was one of the first global mass media campaigns for a prisoner of conscience, combining art, politics, and protest in a worldwide movement. And its importance as a template for these campaigns is, I believe, often underestimated. The 1932 Scottsboro Mooney tour in particular was an early example of the kind of interracial solidarity that often gets foregrounded in protest movements today. And there was another, more curious legacy that I came across in my research. In 1939, after Mooney was released, a young folk musician who had written a song called Mr. Tom Mooney is Free was invited up onto a platform alongside Tom Mooney to sing his composition. That musician was Woody Guthrie, and according to his friend Pete Seeger, it was the night that launched Woody's era-spanning career. So I hope this talk has given you some indication of why I find this story so fascinating as a story from the history of the Irish diaspora. It is a history of both an Irish-American family tragedy and a transformation. The story of how a name, which a Mayo woman gave to her firstborn son, came to be chanted in the streets of Petrograd in the days that rerouted the course of modern history, and was later emblazoned on a flag waved by volunteers fighting for democracy on the battlefields of Spain. It is the story of an Irish-American man who did more to change the course of US history during 2 decades trapped in the cell than many politicians of his era achieved in a lifetime at liberty. It is also the story of his comrades, men and women, many of them Irish and Irish-American, in fact, remarkable numbers of them Irish-American, who shared his commitment to the realization of a new social order, and the story of 2 women in particular, Rena and Mary Mooney, whose greatest loyalty was to Tom himself. And the case of Tom Mooney still has resonance in our own world, particularly in that burning question it asked: is this what justice looks like? The young Tom Mooney, who returned from Europe in 1908 with no idea of what lay before him, and who immediately set about crossing the country with Eugene Debs, would have no doubt nodded in agreement whenever Debs delivered one of his most famous lines: "While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." Mooney case should finally remind us that struggles for prison reform and movements to bring an end to unjust incarceration not only have a past, they have a present. And this lecture series invites those who register to leave a donation for the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland, a group working to bring an end to the system of direct provision termed by the UN as a severe violation of human rights. So with that, I will conclude. I thank you all for listening in, and we will now just turn to the Q&A, but quickly, just to let you know that we have more forthcoming talks in this series in 2021. First, coming up is our Irish Jewish and Irish Jewish history talks, looking at the Irish Jewish diaspora. Then we're looking at Irish travelers abroad, looking at the traveling community in the wider world. And then finally, we're coming back to Ireland and we're turning the lens around and we're looking at migrant communities in Ireland and their contributions to Irish history. And also, just before we go to the Q&A, let you know about a talk that's happening on the 11th of January, which will be, it's linked and I guess to the world of this talk, when Mary Ann Trasiati will be launching a new edition of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's memoir, My Life as a Political Prisoner. So Mary Ann asked me to highlight that, and I was very happy to do so. So with that, let us turn to the Q&A. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I will, no questions submitted as of yet. So I'll see and wait if anyone has any questions, but if there's none, then we can tie up. I will think, is there anything that I cut out that I wanted to discuss that I didn't get a chance to discuss in the talk itself? Well, one thing that I've always found unusual is that Mary Mooney on her worldwide tour didn't land in Ireland. It has erroneously been claimed that she did, but she did not. This is something that troubled Hannah-She Skeffington herself. Now, I haven't been able to get back into the National Archives of Ireland to confirm this, but it seems to be the case that she was not allowed land in Ireland because of a broader kind of red scare in the country regarding the wider Scottsboro Mooney tour itself. That certainly seems to be, that's certainly what Hannah-She Skeffington herself argued as to why Mary Mooney did not land at that time. And then, what do I think Mooney's chief legacy is today? I really think it's a kind of a atmospheric legacy. And let me try and explain what I mean by that. ACT UP, the famous AIDS activism group, had a thing called political funerals, where they would politicize the death of people who had sadly died from AIDS. And in Deborah Gould's History of ACT UP, she notes how those political funerals drew on a how these political funerals drew on a tradition that included, for example, the politicization of funerals within Irish republicanism. Now, neither the Republicans or ACT UP were aware of this connection, but templates of activism passed down through generations of activists, often without those activists knowing where their templates of activism are coming from, or the prototypes of their activism. And I think the Tom Mooney campaign set so many templates. Even that phrase, free blank blank, seems to originate with Tom Mooney. When you think of free Angela Davis or free the Guildford Four or so on. So it's those templates. And what's remarkable to me is that the legacy doesn't seem in many ways so direct, that Tom Mooney, in the historical memory, at least in terms of Irish political prisoners, is often forgotten. He does have some memory in the US, in San Francisco. There's a very famous mural to the city of San Francisco, which charts the history of San Francisco, and it has a whole panel dedicated to the Tom Mooney case. So yes, I guess that would be his legacy. Shane Colotti asks, are there any memorials in San Francisco to the Mooneys? I believe just that panel, which I referenced. And is it possible to visit Mary Mooney's grave? It is. I have it somewhere in my notes, the cemetery, and I believe Tom Mooney was himself buried alongside her. So it probably, I'm sure there's probably some people in San Francisco left who make sure it's well kept. And so yes, you can visit it. I actually didn't get a chance to visit it while I was there because I didn't yet know about exactly where she had been buried while she was there. I did go into Tom Mooney's archive in Berkeley, which you can also go in and see. And I went to San Quentin. I mean, I didn't go into the prison, you're not able to go in, but I passed it by and I went into the parking lot. I just wanted to see what it was like. And I kind of feel that I keep an eye on San Quentin and I listen to it, and it has been particularly dark what has happened there with COVID-19, and there's been a particularly bad outbreak of it in the prison. So yes, you can see certain sites still linked to the case, and I would be surprised if there wasn't some sort of marker on Stewart and Market as well to the 1916 Preparedness Day bombing, because I believe it's to this day one of the worst terror attacks in the history of the city of San Francisco. So I think that is all of our questions for now. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for coming along. Thank you for letting me speak at length about one particular case, but I hope you found it just as fascinating as I have. And I look forward to seeing you at some of our next lectures. And I hope that you all stay safe and well and get to celebrate in a safe manner with your loved ones over the holidays. Thank you very much for tuning in.